Um, Thank you so much to my hosts for this incredibly generous welcome and for your hospitality, and thank you to all the members of the University of Cologne for this really slightly overwhelming honor. If I think about it too much, I will quickly lose the power to speak. So rather than dwell on it, I think I'll begin. And when the format of these talks was explained to me that we would have 2 lectures and then a public discussion, I thought the best way to approach it might be sort of backwards. So I'd like to begin today by trying to give a little sense, in what must be a slightly superficial way, of just how different the picture of the broad sweep of human history, which is now emerging largely from the field of archaeology, but also from a whole range of other allied disciplines, how different that picture is from what I think is still, both among fully qualified academics and also among people in general, if you like, a sort of received wisdom about the general shape of time in human history. And then tomorrow to sort of work backwards and pose the related question of how we got it so wrong in the first place, or where the conventional picture actually originates. And I won't talk in either of these occasions too much about what Professor Speer mentioned, which I think, to me at least, is the concept or set of concepts from my work with David Graeber. And I'd like to also pay tribute to David Graeber and to his friendship and his intellectual partnership, which has been essential to everything I've done for more than a decade now. So this is very much, in my own mind, an honor for him as well. And somehow or other, this concept that Professor Speer mentioned about human freedoms emerged from the work that we were doing together. It's not entirely clear to me when or exactly how it emerged, but it seemed to be a necessity to try and bring together and summarize some of our observations about the nature of human social life outside the framework of modern states, kingdoms, and empires. And we arrived at this conclusion that there are essentially 3 basic forms of freedom, which are not purely individual freedoms, but social freedoms, which I think is a crucial distinction to make, which are extremely common among human societies until relatively recently, at least recently from the point of view of a prehistorian, meaning perhaps the last 400 or 500 years of history. And as you mentioned, Andreas, these are the freedom to move away from one's surroundings in the expectation of receiving asylum or hospitality at your point of destination, the freedom to disobey arbitrary authority, and based on these 2 elementary forms of liberty, the third freedom, the freedom to abandon or dismantle a particular form of social reality, imagine things differently, and then create another sort of society. And I hope that by Friday, when we have the public seminar, we will be at a point where we can discuss perhaps where these freedoms are still to be found today, and their larger role in human history, or perhaps the validity or otherwise of the whole concept. So, I thought today I'd begin instead, as I say, by considering just how much the broad picture of human history has changed in the last 3 or 4 decades, with some concrete examples. But I'll actually begin with a quote, which was the epitaph to my book with David, and it goes like this: "We are living in what the Greeks called Kairos, the right time for a metamorphosis of the gods, that is, of the fundamental principles and symbols." I'm quoting Carl Jung, from his 1958 book, which was published in English with the quite attractive title, The Undiscovered Self. The Undiscovered Self. It's completely different from its original German title, Gegenwart und Zukunft, 1957. I prefer the English one. It's about 70 years now since he wrote that, and I think it's safe to say that Jung's scientific reputation has not fared particularly well. However, when my late co-author, David Graeber, and I were looking for an epitaph for our new history of humanity, which we called The Dawn of Everything, Anfänge auf Deutsch, Jung's words rang true in some way, as does the English title of the book to which they belong, The Undiscovered Self. It is our contention in our book that the basic principles around which we've been orienting our understanding of the human past, and so of ourselves, are flawed. Or as David once put it, playfully on Twitter, prehistory, everything you know is wrong. The occasion for his tweet was the publication of our first essay together in 2018 in an online journal called Eurozine, an essay which had the rather immodest title, How to Change the Course of Human History, subtitle, at least the part that's already happened. In it, we suggested that because of the accumulation of new information in our fields, the anchor points of human history, those reference points around which we structure our consciousness of the deep past, have become unstable, almost to the point of collapse, and that something like a new science of human history will now need to be built. And of course, we don't claim to have done anything like that ourselves, which would be an absurdly arrogant claim for anybody to make. But we do make a case for beginning with a synthesis between the disciplines that we trained in. Me, an archaeologist, and David, an anthropologist. Archaeology being the direct study of the human past from its material remains, and anthropology the comparative study of human societies and cultures. Now, there was a time when these used to be closely related fields. Today, they have drifted apart. We wanted to see what happens when you bring them back together again after a period of mutual estrangement. And the results astonished us because it quickly became apparent that when you begin to do this, a whole new picture of our species, its past and its future possibilities, starts to come into view. But let's very briefly rehearse what you might call the conventional picture of the broad sweep of human history, which has been around for a very long time. In fact, it was created, as I'll discuss a little more tomorrow, mainly by philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, long before there was any direct evidence of what human social life was actually like in the remote past. And here's roughly how it goes. Once upon a time, the story goes, we were hunter-gatherers, living in a prolonged state of childlike innocence, in tiny bands. These bands were egalitarian. They could be, because they were so small. It was only after the agricultural revolution, and then still more the rise of cities, that this happy condition came to an end, ushering in civilization and the state, which also meant the appearance of written literature, science, and philosophy, but at the same time, almost everything bad in human life. Patriarchy, standing armies, mass executions, and annoying bureaucrats demanding that we spend much of our lives filling out forms. Now, of course, this is a very crude simplification, but it really does seem to be the foundational story that rises to the surface whenever anyone, whether it's an industrial psychologist or an urban planner or even a revolutionary theorist, says something like, but of course, human beings spent most of their evolutionary history living in groups of 20 people. Or naturally, the invention of farming was humanity's worst mistake. Many popular writers of so-called big history books make these points quite explicitly today. The only real alternative to this rather depressing view of history, or at least the only one on offer until now, is perhaps even more grim. It says that human societies began not in a state of innocence and equality, but in a state of brutal competition, and that the only way we could progress, especially when populations started to grow, was by taming those base instincts and embracing the existence of governments, courts, bureaucracies, police, and so on. In this view, which perhaps owes more to Thomas Hobbes than to Rousseau, self-interest and the drive to accumulate power have always been at the root of human social behavior. It's just that collectively we've learned it's to our advantage to prioritize long-term interests over short-term instincts, or create laws that force us to keep our dog-eat-dog impulses under control, or confine them to useful areas like the economy. As you'll gather, both ways of understanding the course of human history rest on profound assumptions about human nature. Are we innately good and cooperative, or selfish and competitive? And although they appear to begin from opposite ends of the spectrum, both ways of understanding our past have very similar implications. What they tell us, in essence, is that living in small societies meant a state of freedom and simplicity. Whether that was simply awful and chaotic, or simply wonderful, depends largely who you choose to believe. While living in big societies meant complexity and sophistication, but always at a price. The price of steep inequalities in human welfare and the loss of those original human freedoms. With 8 billion or so people on the planet today, we are left to draw the obvious and dismal conclusion, which is that any real prospect of restructuring society so as to eliminate altogether the most ruthless forms of structural inequality, homelessness, poverty, slavery, racism, sexism, has long ago been taken off the table. The effect of telling such stories again and again is to make wistful pessimism about the human condition seem like common sense. Yes, living in a truly egalitarian society might be possible if you're a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer. But if you want to create a society of true equality today, you're going to have to figure out some way of going back to becoming tiny bands of foragers again with no significant personal property. Since foragers require a pretty extensive territory to forage in, this would mean, presumably, reducing the world's population by something like 99.9%. Otherwise, the best we can hope for is to adjust the size of the boot that will be stomping on our faces forever. Fortunately, there is a problem with these familiar notions of human history and civilization. They're not true. Over the last few decades, information has been pouring in from all quarters of the globe, which throws every aspect of these familiar stories into disarray. Still, as we found, the most remarkable discoveries remain confined to the work of specialists, or have to be teased out from reading between the lines of scientific publications, and very often the specialists are hardly talking to each other, let alone anyone outside their fields to communicate their findings. So my role this evening, as I see it, is to just try and give some sense of how different this emerging picture of human history really seems to be, especially for those who don't have the time or the inclination or the institutional advantages to fight their way through paywalls into the hallowed halls of academic publishing. Let's begin with cities. It used to be thought that on all the world's continents, the first cities emerged together with systems of centralized government and top-down control. Think about ancient Egypt with its pyramid temples, or Shang China with its lavish tombs, the classic Maya with their warlike rulers and deadly ball games, or the Inca Empire with its mountain palaces and its mummified kings and queens. But we know today that this is not the case. For example, cities already existed on the lower reaches of the Yellow River more than 1,000 years before China's first named royal dynasty. And on the other side of the Pacific, along Peru's Rio Supe, cities appear more than 4 millennia before the Inca Empire. We can say very little as yet about how these large human settlements functioned, but their existence is beyond doubt. In other cases, we can say more. In ancient Mesopotamia, the modern countries of Iraq and Syria, archaeology now provides evidence for roughly 1,000 years of urban life before the appearance of kingship and warring states. And even after those appeared, it is abundantly clear that decision-making powers in cities remained heavily vested in things like urban councils and popular assemblies. Around 4,500 years ago, cities arose in the Indus Valley at places like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa in the modern country of Pakistan. But they have left us no clear trace of kings or queens, no grand personal monuments or royal tombs. Much of the population of these first South Asian cities clearly lived in high-quality housing. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, archaeologists working north of the Black Sea were uncovering evidence for still earlier cities, dating back some 6,000 years. Traces of these gigantic settlements lurk less than a meter below the rich, dark soils of the Ukrainian steppe, locally called Chornozem, in the vicinity of the modern city of Uman. They are as ancient and as large as the first Mesopotamian cities, which, just for context, means roughly the size of medieval London. But at no point in their long history do these prehistoric Ukrainian cities present evidence for authoritarian rulers. In fact, they present no trace of central government or social stratification that archaeologists have yet been able to discern. No palaces, no temples, no central stockpiles of wealth, no indication of bureaucratic control. Instead, what we find in this case are some thousands of roughly equally sized houses, domestic buildings carefully organized into a system of neighborhoods with an assembly hall servicing each neighborhood, a strikingly egalitarian pattern of urban life which lasted in this region for almost 1,000 years. Scientific studies of ancient pollen and soils show that this way of life also left a remarkably light footprint on its surrounding environment, despite the existence of large and densely inhabited human settlements. Indeed, scientists in Germany at the University of Kiel have made the case that these early Ukrainian cities practiced a form of urban ecology that actually enriched the land that it inhabited, accelerating the formation of those rich, dark earths, which for centuries after attracted colonizers and empire builders down to the present day. The ancient history of the Ukrainian steppe, I guess, usually conjures images of nomadic kingdoms and mounted warriors, the ancient Scythians and their famous kurgan tombs stuffed with golden treasures. But as this new research shows, there is a deeper history, and it is a history of what might be best described as egalitarian cities. In the Americas, too, modern archaeological science has done much to reverse such stereotypes, revealing deep histories of urbanism and ecological complexity in regions that had long been romanticized as pristine or simple or primitive environments for human habitation. Amazonia is a striking case in point. We know now that by the beginning of the Christian era, the Amazonian landscape was already studded with towns, terraces, monuments, and roadways reaching from the highland kingdoms of Peru all the way to the Caribbean. It seems increasingly clear that long before what we think of as the birth of democracy, there were already well-organized cities on most of the world's continents that simply present no evidence for ruling dynasties and sometimes seem to have done without mandarins, priests, and warrior politicians. Now, of course, not all early cities were like this, and none of the ones that I've described was in any sense perfectly egalitarian. Many of these cases left no urban legacy behind them to continue into the present, and some, of course, went on to become the centers of kingdoms and empires. But it's important to note that others went exactly the opposite way. To take one well-documented example, around the year 200 AD, the city of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico, with a population of at least 100,000 people, underwent a profound transformation, turning its back on pyramid temples and human sacrifices, and reconstructing itself as a vast collection of comfortable villas, subfloor drainage, and spacious living quarters, housing most of the city's population. When archaeologists first began to discover these apartment compounds, they assumed they must be palaces because they're really quite lavish, until it became apparent that they were arranged on an orthogonal grid that covered the entirety of the city. So if everyone is living in a palace, you can reach your own conclusions. Now again, none of this is to claim that any of these societies were perfectly peaceful or egalitarian, but to keep things in perspective, let's recall that 5th century Athens, which we look to today as the birthplace of democracy, was itself a militaristic society founded on chattel slavery and the systematic repression of women. At this point, one might raise a reasonable objection. If cities without rulers or deep structural inequalities were really so common in human history, then surely Europeans would have encountered at least some cities like this when they began their conquest of the Americas. In the 16th century, Mexico, or what's now called Mexico, was teeming with indigenous cities, dominated by the spectacular Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. So why did Cortés and the other conquistadors find only kingdoms and empires? Except this isn't really the case either. In 1519, Hernán Cortés reported back to the King of Spain that on approaching the Valley of Mexico, he had found a city where the order of governance, and I quote from his letter, resembles very much the republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, for there is no supreme overlord. Its name was Tlaxcala, and it turns out that the city of Tlaxcala was run by an elected council, which reached decisions through debate and consensus at a time when such things were extremely rare in Europe and European systems of government north of the Mediterranean. Our knowledge of the workings of this indigenous parliament, urban parliament, is very far from complete. But we do know some telling facts about how individuals were selected for office. Far from being asked to demonstrate personal charisma or the ability to outdo their rivals, those who aspired to a role on the Council of Tlaxcala had to do so in a spirit of self-deprecation. They were required to subordinate themselves to the people of the city, and to ensure that this was no mere performance, each would-be politician was subject to trials, starting with mandatory exposure to public abuse, and then, with your ego sort of in tatters, a long period of seclusion, where the incumbent politician suffered ordeals of fasting, sleep deprivation, bloodletting, and a strict regime of moral instruction. Even after that, politicians might be periodically whipped just to remind them who was actually in charge. So clearly taking up office in this indigenous democracy, and I have no hesitation calling it that, required personality traits rather different from those we take for granted in modern electoral politics. And in fact, it was precisely at Tlaxcala that Cortés found military allies who then enabled him to launch a successful attack on the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which of course is widely understood now as a turning point in the global rise of Western imperialism, something we're taught to think about as a sort of triumph of guns, germs, and steel, forgetting very often that it was also the outcome of a decision-making process in an indigenous parliament. By the way, archaeologists have actually done work at Tlaxcala to uncover the pre-conquest city, and the findings are actually extremely remarkable and interesting. Here too, they found that the most imposing structures were not pyramids or temples, but the well-appointed residences of ordinary citizens arranged around plazas to uniformly high standards. But it's not just our understanding of cities that archaeology is turning on its head. We also know now that the history of human social life before the coming of cities and even before the coming of agriculture is simply nothing like what was once imagined. Far from living most of their lives in small bands of hunter-gatherers, we now have evidence for a truly wild variety of social experimentation before the appearance of agriculture. To give just a flavor of this diversity, let me mention a few examples brought to light by archaeological science in the last few decades. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, prehistorians can now show that hunter-gatherers some 50,000 years ago maintained social networks of impressive scale, spanning large parts of the eastern and southern parts of that continent. In Europe, during the last ice age, around 25,000 years ago, we find evidence all the way across the continent, from Russia to the Mediterranean, that certain individuals were being singled out for grand burials, their bodies saturated with elaborate costumes, weaponry, even things that look like regalia. Archaeologists like to call these burials princes and princesses without necessarily stopping to ask why we find so little evidence for their kingdoms or principalities aside from the burials themselves, and I'll come back to that point in a moment. In Central and Eastern Europe, at that time covered by steppe and tundra, we also find the remains of public buildings constructed from the bones and the tusks of woolly mammoth, standing out clearly from ordinary dwellings. Even more strikingly, in the Middle East, around 11,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers built enormous stone temples at places like Göbekli Tepe in the Urfa Valley of eastern Turkey, centuries before the domestication of wheat and barley. In Japan, we know that the storehouses of Sane Maruyama could already hold massive surpluses of wild plant foods long before the arrival of rice farming from the Korean peninsula. And long before the coming of maize cultivation to North America, indigenous peoples were already constructing massive earthworks, such as those of Poverty Point in modern-day Louisiana, huge amphitheaters that were large enough to hold hunter-gatherer publics in their thousands. Take off the blinkers and you can see before you evidence of a pre-agricultural world that is simply nothing like what we used to think. This was not a world of roving hunter-gatherer bands, although no doubt some of those existed too, but also one of sedentary towns and villages, monumental sanctuaries, and stockpiled wealth. Quite often, it seems, hunter-gatherer societies alternated routinely between hierarchical and egalitarian arrangements, switching around their group size and political structures with the changing requirements of the seasons, taking on radically different forms in times of abundance and times of scarcity. Now, this is important for a variety of reasons, not least because it implies that far from living in a state of primordial innocence or naivety, early human populations would already have been conscious of multiple social possibilities and multiple ways of arranging their affairs, keeping one foot in one sort of social reality and another foot in another. Now, doing this, in other words, radically changing one's social identity or economic habits or political systems with the changing seasons, might sound very appealing, but I think it's something quite difficult for most of us to imagine these days. How such arrangements might have worked in practice can be illuminated, however, by the much more recent history of populations like the Circumpolar Inuit, or the Nambiquara of Mato Grosso, or the First Nations of the American Plains. Anthropologists more than a century ago used to describe societies of this sort as possessing a double morphology. Marcel Mauss, writing in the early 20th century, observed that the circumpolar Inuit, and likewise many other societies, have two social structures, one in summer and one in winter, and that in parallel they have two systems of law and two systems of religion. In the summer months, Inuit, for example, dispersed into small patriarchal bands in pursuit of freshwater fish, caribou, reindeer, each band under the authority of a single male elder. Property was possessively marked, and patriarchs exercised coercive, even tyrannical power over their kin. But in the long winter months, when seals and walrus flocked to the Arctic shore, another social structure entirely took over as Inuit gathered together to build great meeting houses of wood, whale rib, and stone. And within those houses, the virtues of equality, altruism, and collective life prevailed. Wealth was shared. Sexual partners were exchanged under the aegis of Sedna, the goddess of the sea. The Nambiquara of Brazil, as observed in the 1940s by Claude Lévi-Strauss, also lived effectively in two very different societies. During the rainy season, they occupied hilltop villages of several hundred people and practiced horticulture. During the rest of the year, they dispersed into small foraging bands. Chiefs made or lost their reputations by acting as heroic leaders in what Lévi-Strauss calls the nomadic adventures of the dry season, during which times they typically gave orders, resolved crises, and behaved in a manner that at any other time would be regarded as unacceptably authoritarian. But in the wet season, a time of much greater ease and abundance, they relied on those reputations to attract followers to settle around them in villages where they employed only gentle persuasion and led by example to guide these followers in the construction of houses and the tending of gardens. And in doing so, chiefs cared for the sick and the needy, mediated disputes, and never really imposed anything much on anyone. As Lévi-Strauss observed, these seasonal alternations make the so-called traditional Nambiquara chief into a peculiarly modern and familiar kind of political figure, shifting with calm sophistication between what were, in effect, two different social systems, all the while balancing a sense of personal ambition with the common good. Another example were the indigenous hunter-gatherers of Canada's northwest coast, for whom winter, not summer, was the time when society crystallized into its most unequal form, and spectacularly so. Plank-built palaces sprang to life along the coastlines of British Columbia, with hereditary nobles holding court over commoners and slaves and hosting the great banquets known as potlatch. Yet these aristocratic courts broke apart for the summer work of fishing, reverting to smaller clan formations, still ranked, but with an entirely different and less formal structure. And in this case, people actually adopted different names in the summer and the winter, literally becoming somebody else, depending on the time of year. But perhaps most striking in terms of political reversals were the seasonal practices of 19th century tribal confederacies on the American Great Plains. These are one-time farmers who had adopted a nomadic hunting life. In the late summer, small and highly mobile bands of Cheyenne and Lakota would congregate in large settlements to make logistical preparations for the bison hunt. And at this most sensitive time of year, they appointed a police force that exercised full coercive powers, including the right to imprison, whip, or fine any offender who endangered the proceedings, the preparations for the buffalo hunt. Yet, as the anthropologist Robert Lowy observed, this unequivocal authoritarianism operated on a strictly seasonal and temporary basis. giving way to more anarchic forms, as he called them, of organization once the hunting season and the communal Sundance rituals that came afterwards were complete. Also, it's very important to note that membership of these police squadrons actually rotated on an annual basis between the clans. So if you were giving out the hard justice one year, you could expect to be on the receiving end the following year, which has interesting implications, I think, for policing in general. Quite independently, archaeological evidence suggests that in the highly seasonal environment of the last ice age, our remote ancestors were behaving in broadly similar ways, shifting back and forth between alternative social arrangements, permitting the rise of authoritarian structures during certain times of year or in certain ritual contexts on the proviso that they could not last, on the understanding that no particular social order was ever fixed or immutable. Within the same population, one could live sometimes in what looks like a band, at other times in what looks like a tribe, and sometimes with a society that actually has some of the features we now identify with states. With such institutional flexibility comes the capacity to step outside the boundaries of any given social structure and reflect, to both make and unmake the political worlds we live in. If nothing else, this seems to explain better than most other models those strange princes and princesses of the last ice age who seem to show up in such magnificent isolation like characters in some kind of fairy tale or costume drama. So, did the invention of agriculture really mean the onset of durable inequality, or the inception of private property, a departure from some egalitarian Eden? At the very least, I think such findings place these questions in a dramatically different light, and really, this should come as no surprise. Consider, as one final example, the case of the Calusa, one of the first North American societies described by European explorers in the 16th century. The Calusa were a non-agricultural people who inhabited the west coast of Florida, roughly from Tampa Bay down to the Keys. There they had established a small kingdom, ruled from a capital town called Kairos, which today is marked by a 30-hectare complex of high shell mounds known as Mound Key. They lived on fish, shellfish, larger marine animals, as well as deer, raccoon, and a variety of birds. Calusa also maintained a fleet of war canoes with which they would launch military raids on nearby populations, extracting processed foods, including farmed foods, skins, weapons, amber, metals, and slaves as tribute. When Juan Ponce de Leon entered Charlotte Harbor on the 4th of June, 1513, he was met by a well-organized flotilla of such canoes manned by heavily armed hunter-gatherers. Some historians resist calling the Calusa leader a king, preferring terms like paramount chief, but first-hand accounts leave little doubt about his exalted status. At the time of initial European contact, the man known as Carlos, ruler of Kairos, even looked like a European king. He wore a golden diadem and beaded leg bands and sat on a wooden throne, and crucially, he was the only Calusa who was allowed to do this. Now, confronted with such cases, adherents of the view that agriculture was a necessary foundation for durable inequalities, I think have basically two options. You can ignore them, or you can claim that they represent some kind of anomaly. Surely, they will say, foragers who do these sorts of things, raiding their neighbors, stockpiling wealth, creating elaborate court ceremonials, keeping slaves, and so on, are not really foragers at all, or at least not true foragers. Surely they must be farmers by some other means, effectively practicing agriculture just somehow with wild crops or coastal resources, or perhaps somehow caught in a moment of transition on the way to becoming farmers, just not quite arrived. Now, all of these are excellent examples of what the English philosopher Anthony Flew called the no true Scotsman style of argument, also known to logicians as the ad hoc rescue procedure. For those unfamiliar with it, it works like this. Imagine Hamish MacDonald, a Scotsman, sitting down with his Glasgow Morning Herald and seeing an article about how the Brighton sex maniac strikes again. Hamish is shocked and declares that no Scotsman would do such a thing. The next day he sits down, again with his Glasgow Morning Herald, and this time he finds an article about a man from Aberdeen whose brutal actions make the Brighton sex maniac seem almost gentlemanly. This fact shows that Hamish was wrong, in his opinion. But is he going to admit this? Not likely. This time he says, no true Scotsman would do such things. Philosophers frown on this style of argumentation as a classic case of informal fallacy or circular reasoning. You basically assert a proposition, for example, hunter-gatherers do not have aristocracies, and then you protect it from any possible counterexamples by continually moving the goalposts, creating endless subcategories and get-out clauses like complex hunter-gatherers and affluent hunter-gatherers and so on and so forth. But even if we try to unsee all of the accumulated evidence to the contrary, it would still be very difficult, impossible even, to keep propping up the myth of an agricultural revolution and writing off people like the Calusa as evolutionary quirks or anomalies. Because there's another reason why we can't really talk anymore about an agricultural revolution, which is simply that in most parts of the world, from China to the Middle East to Mesoamerica, detailed studies of plant and animal remains from some thousands of archaeological sites now tell us something else, which is that the transition from living on wild resources to a life based on food production was extremely slow. Typically, it takes something in the order of 3,000 years, during which time prehistoric people are moving in and out of farming, combining it rather playfully with a range of foraging, hunting, and other pursuits. Now, even on a generous definition, I think 3,000 years is a long time for a revolution. And in at least some cases, like the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the resulting societies, even at the end of that long process, these early pre-pottery Neolithic societies, actually look strikingly egalitarian by comparison with their hunter-gatherer neighbors. All right, I think it's time to bring a few of these threads together and take stock for today. In the broad sweep of history, there is no longer any particular reason to believe that societies which are small in scale are especially likely to be egalitarian, or that large ones must necessarily have kings, presidents, and top-down structures of administration. These turn out to be just so many prejudices dressed up as facts or even as laws of history. As the historical verdict comes in, we begin to see that egalitarian cities, even regional confederacies, are historically quite commonplace, whereas egalitarian families and households are decidedly not. This fact alone has some far-reaching implications. For example, almost anyone today insists that participatory democracy can perhaps work in a small community or maybe an activist group, but couldn't possibly scale up to anything like a city or a region, let alone a nation. But the evidence before our eyes, if we're prepared to look at it, suggests the opposite. Today, our scientific means of understanding the past, both of our species and of the planet, is advancing with dizzying speed. Scientists in 2023 may not quite be encountering alien civilizations in distant star systems, unless you believe some of the recent headlines, but we are encountering radically different forms of society under our feet, forgotten ways of being human and living together in large numbers. We know now that there was no single original form of human society, and no single trajectory that leads from our origins to the kind of radically unequal societies we now take for granted. Instead, what archaeology and anthropology show us is a multiplicity of paths not taken. This seems all the more important because, as a species, we do now appear to be heading into what the ancient Greeks called the Kairos, a window of time, when our very capacity for change is being tested. If we fail, it is not, I suggest, because of history or evolution. Our remote ancestors were not the drab stick figures of social evolutionism or philosophical speculation. Instead, we turn out to be a playful, inventive species, but a species that now appears to be stuck in a deadly game of extraction and expansion. Growth, 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 as one recent and very short-lived British government liked to put it before they sent us collectively into the harshest of seasons with no safety net. Perhaps what's become clear in the larger scheme of things is that the biggest question facing us now is not how do we get back to equality, but rather something like, have we, Homo sapiens, supposedly the wisest of apes, really forgotten how to change the rules of the game? And I'll finish there for today. Thank you.